Hello, welcome to History Chats. All right, today we are looking at a story that I've been wanting to talk about for quite a while here, as it is one of the more interesting stories in the history of this area, which is the story of the Philosopher Press. Now, some of you may be somewhat familiar with this, but I wanted to kind of give a broader, look at this and look at some of its influences, which I think are pretty cool. So the story starts. I mean, it started a bunch of different places, but I'm going to start it in the year 1897. In that year, well, this is a community that is growing in the late 1890s into the new century. There's sort of a new energy coming into the area. Population is growing. One such person who arrives here is going to embark upon an interesting endeavor. His name is William Ellis. William Ellis is, I'm going to be honest, I don't really know very much about his earlier endeavors. And I guess I should also acknowledge, yes, this is a trained deer, a captive deer. That it is what it is. It's part of the mystique, I guess, that he kind of cultivated here. I don't know, as it started to say, I don't necessarily know as much about his earlier life as I'd like to, but the point is he wasn't local. And as far as I know, I know why he came here. I don't know why he came here. I don't know if there was personal connections to this area or what have you. He certainly wasn't, from here, and all of that. But it's really not super important. What is important is that he comes here and he has an idea that he would really love to create a press. And he's going to name it the Philosopher Press. Now, to get help with this, originally he links up with a man named Edgar Wheelock. And Edgar is going to be a contributor to some of the endeavors that they end up getting into, but ultimately he is his own press-related industry. He is more associated with, let's see, did I write it down? Maybe. I don't remember specifically the name, but it's essentially the Wausau Record Herald at the time, but the iteration in the 1890s. I want to say it was the Wausau Record. Whatever it is, he's more involved in the sort of the news publication side of things. And although they also did some press work too. But the printing shop that William Ellis is going to create is going to find more long-term connections with the Van Vechtens, who also moved to town. We'll talk about Helen and Philip in a second here. But there is sort of also a larger community that emerges. And this is a community that is, centered around this idea of doing a press, publishing materials in this interesting style. And it's part of an interesting movement. This is the group of them. Now, I'm going to be honest, I don't know who all of these people are. Obviously, Helen Van Vechten is here. I believe the guy, in the facing us here, has been identified as her husband Philip. Um, I I have no reason to doubt this, but we also have no way of double checking because we have pictures of him. But I'm just gonna throw out the name, the possible guess that this is. Here, let me actually make this a little bit more. I don't know if you can see it a little bit better. The guy seated next between Helen and Philip here, maybe that's Edgar Wheelock with his connections. And then this is William Ellis. Now, I don't know who this guy is. We'll talk about him in a bit. It's going to be more relevant in the later in the story. But for now, let's talk about what they get up to. Just do this. Yeah, there we go. What are they getting up to? Well, let's talk about Helen. So as I said, the Van Vechtens, also, Helen is from the area. She was originally born Helen Gilbert. Her father dies when she was young. She ends up taking the name of her stepfather, adopted father, Bruno. She goes off to college to get an education. And I could be wrong. I'm not as crisp on these details, so I apologize if I'm getting this wrong. I think this is the story. She ends up meeting Philip. They get married. They move back to town here. Now, Philip, both of them have some definitely artistic interests and talent, to be sure. Philip and Helen end up having this connection with William Ellis somehow, and they decide to become investors and help out with this endeavor. And Philip provides some of the wood cutting and prints some of the illustrations that appear in some of the early editions of their works. Helen doesn't necessarily have an interest or a background in printing necessarily, but she says, I'll help, and ends up kind of pretty revolutionizing this particular style of printing. Turns out she's just really good at it. She had an eye for what works and how to make things work, and it's going to be really important. She's going to be very important. Now, throughout the tenure of the Philosopher Press, the owners will be explicitly said Ellis and Van Vechten, and when they give their first names, it's Philip. Helen doesn't get ownership in the billing. This is the 1890s into the new century. That would be kind of unusual, but she definitely was a big part of the partnership, whether she was acknowledged or not. And in many of their materials, they make a big deal about Helen is very much involved, and it's thanks to her the care of the materials that we can put out are possible. To get an understanding of what she was doing, let's actually take a look at the books. Let's look at some printed examples here. A second. There's my microphone. All right, I have some displays here. So we have a collection here of materials from the Philosopher Press over the years. And I'm going to show you some of them. These are just a handful of them. A big thanks to Florence Wellen, who's a relative of Helen Van Vechten's. First she also wrote a thesis, her master's in library science, back in 1968 on the Philosopher Press, which was really, really helpful in a lot of the research for this. I'm very much making use of her research for my presentation here. But she also gave us a good number of books to add to our collections, which we're able to do. So these are the sort of things that we're creating. Now, as a print shop, they were not just making books bound books like this. They would do stuff for local people. So this is the sort of thing where, hey, if you need somebody to, print you a, for example, this is a later edition, but this is a in memoriam, and this is for Reverend Frederick Waldo Barker. Let me see. It didn't actually focus. So this is something that they produced in pretty small numbers, as a memorial. We have other examples of, gifts that somebody might want to produce. They maybe made a dozen copies and circulated of a poem or a work. They would reprint them. Some of the things are originals. Some of the early contributors, they had a lot of contributors over the years. And some of them are well known. A lot of them are maybe lesser known in the full. For example, here's a book by Robert Louis Stevenson. That's a pretty well-known name. This is not the original printing. This is a printing of it. Of course, the other great example, and one of the landmark books that they end up doing, we have two sizes here, but this is Lewis Carroll's, let's see if it'll focus here, Hunting of the Snark. There we go. And this is, it's beautiful. Well, actually, let me grab the larger book because it's even more ornate. You can get the idea of it. So it has multiple colors. So there's a red and a black ink. There's these wonderful illustrations here, them done by Gardner C. Teal, who was lived in Eau Claire, kind of an important figure in Wisconsin there. And then you have the text itself, which is reprinted. Again, not the original printing. This is published in 1897, one of the first books that they put together. The book had, the story had been written a long time ago. And this is definitely not the first in the United States either. But it is a republishing and sort of a reimagining. And of course, the printing on the outside is just marvelous as well. So there are some examples here of, books that were republished essentially to get them into circulation. Back then, books were not necessarily as widely published as they might be today. So if you want to get a copy of it and it was out of print, hey, you could get somebody to print, or maybe they would, I don't know. I also don't know how copyright worked. Like, did they have to get permission from the estate of Lewis Carroll in order to publish The Hunting of the Snark? Did they care as long as it got out there? I'm not sure. There was some original things that they published, quite a few actually. Notably, this is one of their first books that they published. This is A Strange Experiment by Laura Cook Barker. Oh, here, let me open it up. Maybe that'll help. She has the distinction of being the first woman to publish a novel in Wisconsin. This is not a novel. This is a short story, I guess. No fancy illustrations, just the text here. But certainly a local resource. I mean, and I'm not going to necessarily get into all of the people that published with them, both as part of their bookmaking process or other. The Philosopher, they had a newsletter. This is what one of the early original copies looked like. These are what, and we'll get into the specifics of why they did it this way and what this is. But this is what's called a chapbook style monthly magazine, in which there would be, I don't want to, poems and short stories and musings of all sorts. They also, you could buy the omnibus, the collected works. So this is an example of the first volume here, in which they have the things. So you could get this once everything was done. You could get. They only did the first 5 volumes this way, but you could also exchange your individual copies for a bound copy. They didn't necessarily bind everything. So as you can see, it's a nice mix of different things that they did. They also did things like. This is a manual for the public schools of Wausau, Wisconsin, and it has, some handbooks, some suggested reading. This would have been amazing if you used this as the. There we go. Like some readers, essentially. They kind of try to make their own reader. It says compromising a collection of memory gems for use in grade work, the courses of study, a dictionary of the teachers and alumni. So a bunch of things happening there. Also, just one more example. Actually, 2 more examples. This is basically a yearbook for the Ladies Literary Society in Wausau, of which Helen was a member. So let's see if it'll, yeah. So very kind of cool. This is pretty, a lot of work went into that relative. Last one I'll point out here, and this is just scratching the surface. There's a long list of things. Local, influential figure in a bunch of different ways. Neil Brown wrote a book called Critical Confessions. They did one edition. It's a bunch of short stories and literary criticisms and things that he did. And then they did a second volume as well. So sometimes it's for local people, sometimes not. They had pretty ranging in terms of all of that. Last thing I want to talk about is what actually Helen brought to the table in terms of her innovation. Apparently, the story goes that when they were doing the hunting of the Snark here, she was helping out in the press, right? She was helping with the printing process. The way that they made these is really interesting, and you can see some minor mistakes that apparently they decided not to address. Let me see if I can find it. I think it's in this one. So you'll notice too that a lot of so this is all hand made essentially is the way that they would make these books. This is not the way that you would do this if you were a commercial press, right? They would hand letter or hand set the type, and then they would run the paper through, and then they would make the books. Sometimes you can see, especially if they're doing multiple colors, you can see the alignment here is a little off. Like you can see they put through the black or the red, and the red is just a little tall, higher up than the black. That is not ideal. This was close enough that they decided to keep it, but one of the problems is the register kept getting off, especially the way that they were using the paper and the way they would run it through. Here, let me show you an example. One of there's a lot, and I'm very much, this is a very broad generalization, and I am not an expert to speak on the nature of this, but one of the ways that you can make a book of paper, essentially, to make pages, is you take a sheet of paper, so like just using this as I have it here, and you fold it, and then you fold it again, so that you have basically a little booklet. You secure it this way, and then you have a bunch of pages, right? It leads to this part being open, and you'd have to cut this. So sometimes you see, for example, let me put this back on. This is another book that was put together by Laura Cook Barker, Mezzokin's here, beautiful cover, purple cover. But you can see that the pages are not cut. Which probably means it hasn't been read if you're looking at old books. But you can see that there's a bunch of paper. So that's how that works, right? The problem that ends up coming, especially if you're using paper that has these frayed edges, it's not like uniformly cut to like a standard measurement. Once you feed it through, if you want each of these pages to have text on it, you need to kind of be able to shift things, right? And you need to run it through, especially if you're doing multiple colors. You need to make sure that they're going through uniformly. The problem is they would reset, put it through the other side, and it would be off. And this meant that they often had to redo it, or it just didn't align correctly. Not ideal. Well, Helen was watching this process as they're printing the hunting of the Snark. She says, "Well, why don't you just run it backwards? We run it through once. Why don't you just run it through this way?" And they say, "Yeah, well, that's not how that works." Let me back here. So these printing machinery, you don't run them through backwards. It's not how that works. And she said, "Well, why don't we try it?" So they try it, and it works perfectly. And so as it turns out, by running it backwards, then you don't have to reset, and the register is nice and clean. I think I'm getting the technical stuff there. I apologize if I'm off on that, but that seems to be the case. Whatever the case is, she realizes by seeing the process, she kind of immediately goes, "Well, why don't we do it a better way?" And they say, "Oh, yeah, okay," and they do that. And so pretty quickly, she becomes sort of the person in charge of the printing shop They did. It's a very small group. Philip, her husband, kind of goes off and gets involved in other things, either because of lack of interest or because he didn't have as much. He's more of a financial backer, maybe in a big picture stuff, but day to day he doesn't need to be there. William starts to hey, let's publish stuff and kind of make connections and kind of do all of that. And Helen is the one that's kind of in charge of everything. And they would have some help hired hands, some boys in the shop to help actually do the manual labor, but she was in charge, right? So, very cool. So it's a fruitful partnership. I want to point out that this is very cool. So this is the interior of the printer shop that they have. On the walls, they have all of these examples of other newsletters and magazines. Notably, the chapbook. There's a bunch here. Oh, yeah, I was going to explain that. So the chapbook is interesting. One of the influences that definitely gets involved here. Let's see, did I? Oh, here. So in 1894, a couple years earlier, some former Harvard graduates decided to start their own little publishing company. Ingalls Kimball and Herbert Stone. And they decide to publish this sort of revive this concept of the chapter book, which is something that they did back in Britain years ago. I think it had fallen out of fashion by this point. But rather than publish a full book, they did it booklets, little chapter by chapter, and that sort of small scale thing. They weren't publishing like novels, right, chapter by chapter. But the chapbook becomes this magazine, this monthly, I think it's monthly, maybe bi-monthly, where they would highlight stuff. And this is part of a larger movement where I think there was the Industrial Revolution made it possible for printers to print much more widely. More people were the literacy rates were going up, and so there was this larger opportunity for people to access written stuff. Well, the chapbook is a response to the kind of gatekeeping that happens in the intellectual establishment, right? There were maybe a dozen places if you were a poet that you could get published in the 1880s and early 1890s. And if you didn't conform to what those people thought was appropriate, what was actually worth publishing, you were kind of out of luck. And so the chapbook is an opportunity to essentially go off on your own and publish stuff that they thought was interesting and worthwhile. They published a lot of stuff from European authors and American authors that would have been said to have been from this guy Max Nordau, who's a German writer, philosopher. Let's see, what did I write down? What he called them? I think he did. Well, he basically said that these authors who were trying to do stuff that wasn't in the establishment, the traditional vein of literature and things, he said that they were insane. And sort of this becomes, it kind of emblematic of this sort of a philosophy of just, well, hey, we're going to lean into that. We're going to publish all sorts of stuff, and there becomes an audience for this. So the chapbook, the covers, of course, get very colorful and artistic, which is, you can see why they kept some of these for inspiration. The Philosopher is in many ways, so this is the newsletter, or the monthly, the chapbook style monthly that, they publish here, right, in these books, or as individual things, very much in the vein of the chapbook, right? Direct response. And you can see, I just thought I'd throw some covers in here. They're not quite so elaborate, although there's sometimes they get there. But there's definitely a lot of care that goes into the creation of these, which is very interesting. I'll also note that their second volume, right, their second volume of The Philosopher in 1897, sort of towards the end, they follow for example, they follow the example of the chapbooks in that they decided to go with the larger format. Let's see, I think I have an example here. Yeah. So this is, well, here, actually, I guess I can do this. This is the size of the second edition, whereas this is the first edition. So you can see the difference, right? And that's the same format that they switched to. When they go back to this after the failure of the chapbook, Ellis kind of goes, nope, we're going to go back to this size. But they do decide to go do away with the illustrations that they had included in the past. And that also was something that the chapbook kind of did. So you can see it's very influential in a lot of their philosophy in terms of, their monthly. I'll also just note, interestingly, there's a lot of other chapbook influenced magazines. This is just a handful of them that are printed. Some of them are more tongue-in-cheekily named than others. I'll also note that, just as an interesting point of trivia here, Le Petit Journal de Refusé here, that was actually published on newspaper, fine wallpaper. So they were trying some stuff, right? Of all of these, probably the most influential is probably the Philistine. We'll talk about that in a second. But in the meantime, you see this group. Here's this picture, right? This is where the deer, and Helen with her dog. She had, I think, 2 dogs. So that you have the core 3 who are involved in this. You also have, well, this guy. Mentioned him. We was facing their direction before. Now, here in Wausau, we often have claimed that this is Neil Brown, lawyer, politician, philosopher, the sage of Wausau, trout fisher, very good flapjacks, a lot of accolades you can throw at him. Well, he was very much involved, and he was a big contributor. As I said, he had his book published by the Philosopher Press, but I'm kind of skeptical that is him, because, I mean, it kind of fits, but I think actually this is him. I think he is in the picture. Hold on, let me do the pointer. I think he's actually standing back here. It's really hard to tell. It's possible then, because this was taken about 1902, 1903. He was married at the time, and I'm not going to go deep into Neil Brown's story. We'll revisit Neil Brown in the near future, I think. A lot more to say, but I think this is maybe possibly. I think this is Louise, his wife at the time. So who is this then? Well, I would suggest, as did Florence Welland in her dissertation. Hold on. It's going to bother me if that pointer is just sitting there. This is Elbert Hubbard. Elbert. They always have weird names. A lot of these artists, sort of types from New England. Elbert Hubbard is probably best known. He is a giant of the industry, and I think one of the reasons that I wanted to do all this, and I'm looking at the clock here. I apologize. This is probably going to go a little bit longer than I normally go, but it's a fascinating thing here, so I hope you bear with me. Elbert Hubbard is kind of the key to understanding the whole development of why this is part of this movement, right? Why are these 3 folks from Wausau recently arrived or returned in 1897 taking part in a national, or actually an international movement? And it's largely because of the influence of Elbert Hubbard. In part because he translates another guy. He's going to have his own press that he creates. I guess I can give a little bit of background here. He had a successful printing business, I think printing. In his 30s, he decides to go off to Harvard University to get an education, drops out. He's deeply unsatisfied with the way that all works. And so then he starts to create a press, Roycroft, which is in the vein, sort of the Americanized iteration of William Morris, who we'll talk about in a second. And he's going to then also create, as I mentioned, the Philistine, a periodical of protest, which is very much what this is all about. But let's talk about William Morris for a bit. William Morris is important in a lot of different industries. He's probably best known in a larger scheme of things for his design as a textile, or textile designing and wallpaper manufacturing. In fact, I've been using a bunch of his wallpaper designs as backgrounds because they're easier than the sort of printed stuff. But some beautiful backgrounds that thanks to William Morris, and people who have digitized and made it available. William Morris is really interesting, and I'm not going to scratch the surface of the deep, interesting background of what he did with his life. But one of the philosophies, he's really one of the major figures in the arts and crafts movement. And I think we can see it. You might have heard that term. You might even know a little bit about it. I think that it illustrates really nicely in the printing industry. As I said, the Industrial Revolution is making it possible to really pump out lots and lots of printed material. And that's great. It means that people have a more incentive to learn how to read. Literacy rates go up. People are maybe better, hey, novels and all these things emerge, right? But to a lot of people, it's an illustration of the difficulty of the modern era. William Morris is often sort of he'd be a socialist, I think you'd call him. I don't know if it's proto-socialist. It's not the socialism that we're going to see in the 20th century for certain. But he really felt that the modern era and the industrialized urban experience was not maybe great for workers. Like clearly there's something lacking there. And so to him, well, how do we adjust for that? And he decides, what would really be good is the having work that's worth doing. And one of the things that he did is he looked at like all of the printing presses that are operating and cranking out these newspapers and magazines and books that were made on very cheap paper with ink that wasn't meant to last. Very little thought went into the presentation and the nature of what we're doing. The text font or the text typefacing. Not even just the content. The content isn't great either. And so he really wants to kind of change things. And so, well, what do? Well, he creates the Clemschott Press printing shop. I think I'm saying that right, Clemschott. It's in Britain, where he is. In England? I should probably looked up where that was. You can look it up if you're interested in Morris. Please do. Fascinating guy. One of the things that, as you can kind of tell by some of the iconography here, this is very sort of medieval. And he definitely took inspiration going back to the early printing that was done under the medieval era, especially by people that were starting to establish Romanized type. The type that we all use today has its roots back in, parts of Italy in the 1440s, right? And in particular, he made his own type, and he studied the type that had been done back in the day, and he cut three very iconic types here: Golden, Troy, and Chaucer. And particularly Golden is pretty influential. And just to illustrate some interesting sort of lineage here. This goes back to basically this becomes so successful that it gets knocked off by a bunch of Americans. Just blatantly, they steal it. Dickinson Type Foundry of Boston starts it in 1895. Later, the type gets sort of pulled into the American type founders. Anyway, they have this type called Jensen, and it is basically a straight knockoff of Golden. Yeah. That's what actually they use to print. This isn't going to be a great example. I didn't want to necessarily. I didn't get around to scanning it, but in fact, the Hunting of the Snark here. That's what this text is. Let's see. Am I doing the right? There we go. Backwards. All right, it's not going to want to do this. Okay, maybe not the best example, but just take my word for it. This is Jensen, this Americanized sort of knockoff of Golden. Something that actually they were given a little bit of criticism for, because, hey, you're not making your own type, you're just using this knockoff. But they do use it in the Philosopher Press for a few of the first few books that they put out. The name Jensen actually goes back to the originator. This is the Nicolas Jensen, who's a French born typesetter in Venice, who in the 1440s basically creates this very iconic script. This is kind of emblematic of the whole thing, right? Clemschott and Morris were all about hand making a book, hand making the quality paper, making the ink so it would last, leather bound editions, a lot of care, like hand carving the plates that would then create the press. That was all of that work was emblematic of the intention behind it made the quality of the book that came out of it, like they used to do, right? The medieval scribes, the illustrated, type and all of that, that's not something that they were spending, they weren't making 600 copies of that, 1,000 copies of it. They're making like 1, 2, 3 of them, right? And they become such more valuable because of it. And the process of artistically putting in that effort was thought, Morris felt that would be the way that we could kind of make lives of workers better. This is what we should do. And this becomes kind of emblematic of one of the sort of streams of arts and crafts, which was kind of a reaction to that industrialized overproduction, or not overproduction, but, mass-produced, lower quality things is, well, make it yourself and understand the artistry behind it. And obviously there's different iterations and, of, architecture has a slightly different story than printmaking and, other things like that. Just a quick note here, because it's interesting. There are actually a bunch of modern typefaces. I've been using a lot of Adobe Jensen, which is the Adobe sort of iteration of the American typefaces based off of William Morris, which is based off of the original guy there. But Centaur and Hightower Text are also two that are pretty common, kind of very much in the same vein. Although I will say that Golden Type does not have bold. The original Morris did not have bold. It did not have punctuation, I think. So adding some stuff there. Anyway, moving on. Elbert Hubbard is really important because he kind of hybridizes the anti-establishment ideas of the chapbook, right? He actually was briefly classmates with the creators of the chapbook, and he embodies that while also very much being in that sort of neo-medieval sort of ideas of Morris. Roycroft is sort of patterned very much off of Klemschott. And, again, they publish a bunch of things like the Philistine, in which, periodical protest. And yet, again, the idea here being the devotees of Morris would have were, and I should say, this is all happening very quickly. Morris creates his press, Klemschott, in like 1890. And dies in 1896, and within a year, Philosopher Press gets created. So this is not like 30 years later, this kind of continues to happen. This is all happening pretty quickly within a few years of each other. The Philistine, it is very much a reaction to that. The followers of Morris were kind of like, well, you're kind of co-opting the movement and trying to take on the intellectual establishment, and that's not really what we're trying to do. But it's very successful, and you can't argue with that, particularly because the middle class kind of enjoyed the sort of criticism of the intellectuals, and so they were willing to purchase the Philistine in large numbers and other books that were created and kind of take part in the larger movement. And just to give you an idea, obviously I showed the picture of what I believe. I know that Ellis did host Hubbard, Albert, I think his name is. Again, I for whatever reason that name just kind of keeps morphing into Elbert or Elgard or whatever. Hubbard, he does come to Wausau, to the Philosopher Press, and hangs out here and talks with them. And in conjunction, Ellis is very much influenced by him. And you can kind of see here, this is from the, Ellis has a column in the Philosopher that he puts out every edition or so. He called it the smoking room. It doesn't always remain that. It kind of goes back and forth, but that's kind of what he calls it. This is from the first edition in 1897, and he explains, hey, why did you create the name? And now for philosophy. Let's try that again. And now for philosophy. I don't know what the best or any dictionary would define philosophy to be, and I don't care. Dictionaries are of little value in the use of language. Let's leave them to those who want to use words. And then he goes on to kind of have this... he tries to be folksy and sort of relatable in a sort of anti. I'm not up on my high horse or on the ivory tower sort of thing. So I'm just going to read it. And language is so much more than words that you can tell by the glance of an eye that a maiden means, whose tongue you cannot understand. And when your wife kicks you under the table, you don't even need to see her face to know that there are no more potatoes on the stove, and you are giving the company too much. Well, in the same way that we philosophize about things without saying anything very serious or bothering very much about how we say it, only so that after all, something has been said by somebody, no matter by whom. So you can kind of get a sense of that, of being like, I don't know. Will Ellis seems to try very hard to be like, I'm not like those guys. I am folksy. The, there are some of his writing that he throws in apostrophes in a way that is just like, we get it. It's it's an ing. You don't need to put in. I don't know. It's frustrating to read from this far in the future. It just kind of is like, I get it, but very much he's in that movement. Very much, he talks about the Philistine and Hubbard a lot in his column, and throughout his works. Even to the point where I should say also that Hubbard has some justifiable criticism that is heaped at him in his legacy. He maybe is partially exploiting some of the people working for him and doesn't necessarily treat well with his partners. Ellis doesn't talk about that stuff, even though he's very much aware of it and probably was sympathetic to Hubbard's partners. But clearly he's very much influenced by this, is I guess the point. He is also very anti-intellectual. The media, the established presses, we're not fond of that. And that actually kind of goes back to one of the things that, there's sort of this idea of transcendentalism, which, again, I'm throwing a lot of weird stuff in here. There's a whole long Wikipedia page explaining that's not really the important part. Transcendentalism is probably, I'm seeing it kind of like they're influenced by people like Ralph Waldo Emerson. It's this idea in early American, the 1800s, of, hey, we are living simply, like transcendentalism, a big part of this is like the importance of nature and, engaging with it and all of this sort of thing. And Emerson, I think, the idea of like going off and living simply, Walden Pond, all of that stuff, very much has an influence in these guys. So it's all of that stuff. There's the fact that they're doing like the hunting of the snark and sort of Lewis Carroll, sort of gibberish, sort of fancy, almost nonsensical in sometimes. I think that is very much intentional. There's a lot of that kind of runs through. There's also a very strong attachment to nature. And you can see this pretty clearly, like in the fact that, I mean, they joke about it. And you might wonder, like, well, hey, if you're going to be trying to be involved in this movement, why are you living in Wausau, Wisconsin? Like, why did he come here in 1897? And actually, in another, I'm going to borrow again, thanks to the thesis here by Florence Wellen. She quotes him as saying, "A good many people have taken occasion at one time or another to rail at me in personal correspondence for going into the pinery woods to found a brand new school of philosophy. Why, bless your souls, there is no place on earth where the genuine article buds and blooms and blossoms to fruition as it does right here in the northern Wisconsin. How can a man be calm and collected with one hand while he is grabbing the rear platform of a receding suburban train with the other? What peace of mind can you expect from a man who has to wait for an elevator every time he wants to go down to the post office to see if the mail has come in? And who eats lunch at a pie counter 6 days in the week? Now here, up in the country we live, there is no provinciality like that of your city man. Provinciality? Probably. Hey, he jokes that, hey, we should be in a log cabin, and they build a log cabin and they move everything into it. And this is the log cabin where the Philosopher Press was produced out of for a long time. Actually, it's still around. The building is, at least. It's located here in Wausau. In private hands now, but you can see the The character is kind of still there, kind of next to the Bellis and McClellan here. Yeah. But anyway, that aside, that's a very conscious part of what they are. And by 1904, they start to include in the Philosopher the creed of the philosopher. And you can see a lot of the philosophy, no pun intended, I guess, in here. Believe in God and man. We believe that within ourselves lies heaven and hell. We believe that everything is inspired that is inspiring. We believe in, capital N, nature, animate and inanimate. We believe that each day is a step in the ladder that leads up. We believe in the clean hand, the clean mind, and the clean heart. We believe in expressing the soul's best thought in the hand's best work. We believe in honesty and sincerity with energy. We believe in beauty and simplicity with utility. We believe in the dignity of toil and the joy of work, and that we shall yet win back art to our daily labor. And this is very much in the Morris sort of vein of things, right? This is hard work, nature, this genuine expression that is what is going to make things worthwhile. And, again, there's also, I don't know, there's a lot of other things that it's occurring to me that I didn't include, but this is already going late. There's a lot of, equality in sort of gender background, like a lot of women, not only like Helen is taking part in the creation of this, but they spotlight a lot of very talented women who are, doing some really great things that otherwise wouldn't get an opportunity to do things and be published, or, maybe not as widely. There's a lot of stuff that goes into this, but I just note that, again, the dignity of toil and the joy of work, that is very much in the philosophy of Morris. Just for contrast, taken in maybe a slightly more hardcore way of seeing things, I guess. This is the motto of Roycroft Hubbard's, which they believed that life without industry is guilt, industry without art is brutality. I don't think they would take it quite that far, but you kind of get the idea. It was an interesting endeavor, right? And between the hard work that they put in, they did something really interesting. Now, ultimately, not everything lasts forever. The organization, Ellis leaves Wausau under some interesting circumstances that I won't get into here, but he ends up back in Chicago. I think perhaps, despite the philosophical idea of being in a log cabin under the green pine tree, the sign of the green pine tree, maybe not in full, as great of a business decision if you wanted to make a living. Still, even after he leaves in 1908, the Van Vechtens continue to run the press. I should say Helen. Philip at this point is getting involved in the new auto cars. He worked for the Wausau Motor Car Company for a bit. A bunch of other things too. But Helen kind of keeps the press going. Again, doing sort of local publishing work. They weren't publishing, Lewis Carroll stories or, the sort of thing that they were doing before with Ellis in charge. But she continues to do this. Eventually, Edwin Steckel takes over. And they move around. They're not necessarily in this building. Edwin Steckel takes over around 1916 and continues to run the Philosopher Press until 1940 or so. At which point, one of the assistants, Mrs. Hilda K. Davis, takes over for another couple years before it finally disappears. And the name Philosopher Press, recedes into the past. But even during the tenure that Ellis and the Van Vechtens were publishing, 11 years is a long time relative to some of these sort of arts and crafts, chapbook style, presses. And for that, it's, kind of interesting. Yeah, I think maybe I'll wrap up there. I can't remember if there's anything else that I was going to say. Except to say thank you for watching. I hope this was interesting. Like I said, this is a story that I've been kind of contemplating doing for a while, and I think I did okay. I apologize if I got any experts out there on bookmaking or whatever. I'm way off, but you always do your best to synthesize the information as best as you can. Yeah, maybe I think there's maybe a room to return. We can actually look at some of the specific publications or stuff like that in the future. So we'll keep that in mind. While you're here, if you're still here, I guess I can tell you about what's coming up next week. well, not next week, but in a couple weeks here. We have our next History Speaks, which is going to be the internment of the Japanese Americans in World War II. So Dr. Henry Kanemoto was local here, and he is going to be, he was actually born in an internment camp during World War II as a Japanese American citizen. And so he's going to tell us a little bit about, how that all came to be and his experiences and all of that. It'd be a great talk coming up, and hopefully we'll look forward to maybe seeing you there. Next week, though, we're going to go back to another sort of behind the scenes about the exhibit. And I figured it'd be interesting to talk about some of the audio stories, since this is a format that maybe we can talk about some of that. So looking forward to doing that. More history to come. Yeah. Well, thanks for watching. Again, hopefully you enjoyed. And hope you have a wonderful afternoon or rest of your day. And we will see you next time for some more history.